So without further ado, it gives me absolute great pleasure to introduce Mark Knight. Mark is an archaeologist with the Cambridge Archaeological Unit at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. His research focus is the prehistory of the Cambridgeshire Fens and the deeply buried landscapes made accessible via commercial development and large-scale mineral extractions. Mark is going to introduce us to sites such as Bradley Fen and Must Farm, which represent key examples of his work. Mark, over to you and dispatches from beneath the peat, the Must Farm pile dwelling settlement. Thank you.
Thank you. What is archaeology? Or what is archaeology in the context of digging prehistory in Finland? I thought to answer this question, I would share my perspective on Fenland archaeology, one that comes from the bottom up, a standpoint, in this case literally, that focuses upon establishing the sequence of lived-on surfaces from the bottom to the top. My first image shows two surfaces, one that you can't quite see. It's the horizon that I'm stood on in the test pit. The second is the modern field surface. In the background, you can make out the grass-covered top of a mound or earthwork of a late Neolithic or early Bronze Age round barrow, one of several now emerging in the Nene washes. In the foreground is a test pit being hand excavated to reach the buried soil or old land surface contemporary with the round barrow's construction and use. What is clear from this image is that the prehistoric land surface is considerably deeper than the present-day grassy field. The difference is about 1.2 metres, or approximately 4,000 years. In reality, the distance between the two surfaces is shrinking. If we were to have dug this same test pit 100 years ago, it would have measured at least 2 metres deep, and you wouldn't have been able to see my balding head or have any idea that this part of Fenland was full of deeply buried burial monuments. My head and the crown of the barrow would have been obscured. The draining of the fens is an ongoing process, and with it so is the shrinking of the silts and peats that make it the flat agricultural landscape it is today. As the silts and peats dry out, they contract, or with continued ploughing and exposure, are quite literally blown away. The relationship between depth and time, or age and altitude, is why I prefer to excavate the fens. It is also because past lived-on surfaces are well preserved, and most importantly, kept separate by a sequence or succession of deposits laid down throughout the Holocene. As I will show, the Fenland sequence is commensurate with later prehistory. Another way to illustrate this dynamic is to move further out into the Fenland Basin, where the preserving cover is even deeper. My second slide shows a section through the sediment sequence of a different part of Fenland, the Silt Fen north of Thorney, at the border between Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. Here you get a proper sense of depth. The section is very close to being 3 metres deep. The bulk of the section is made up of marine silts, the blues, oranges and browns, laid down at the very beginning of the Bronze Age when the sea inundated this part of Fenland, either as tidal mudflats or tidal creeks. Importantly, at the very base of this deep section is a buried soil or old land surface. It's the 20 centimetre thick, dark grey, sandy loam separated from the marine silts by a thin, dark humic horizon. The height of this surface is 3 metres below sea level. And if we go in closer, you can see that buried soil, you can see that humic horizon that sits over the top of it, and then the marine or the thin buttery clay over the top. We grabbed a portion of this buried soil and put it on the top of the surface and hand sorted it and pulled out 4 Neolithic worked flints. So this is a single hole down through metres of sediment. We find the old land surface and then we find artifacts within it. And this is what that test pit looked like on the surface. And you can see that there's nothing to show. There's no sense of what the paleotopography is or where the sites are. It's just a big flat Fenland field, which we use a machine to punch these holes into and try and characterize the paleotopography and the sediment sequence. And by doing multiple test pits, we're able to create these profiles, and we can trace the buried soil of the old land surface in its relationship to the subsequent Holocene sediment sequence. So the lower peat and the fen clay and the big rodents or the old paleochannels of the sort of tidal creeks that once crossed this part of Fenland. And on the same slide, you can see test pit 40. You can see its profile being reproduced, and the old land surface down at 3 meters below sea level, and the number of worked flint we found in that location. So this is a way of characterizing Fenland. It's what I call digging small holes to find the big. And in my presentation today, I'm going to carry on with that thing, but also think about digging big holes to find the small. So we're not the first people to explore the Holocene sequence, and we can go back to 1935 and the Fenland Research Committee and Graham Clark and Harry Godwin, and back to the sort of, I suppose, the sort of flagship site of Fenland, which is Peacock's Farm. And this is where the Fenland Research Committee sunk a trench into the deep fen, and were able to articulate the Holocene sequence of the lower peat, the buttery clay or fen clay, and the upper peat. But more importantly, and this is what Clark called his sort of delicate chronological scale, he was able to articulate that sequence in relationship to archaeological deposits. So at the base, where it says this black band, he found Mesolithic worked flint. And then just above that, in another layer, he found early Neolithic pottery. And then higher up again, above the fen clay, he found early Bronze Age pottery and flint. And this was the first time, and you have to remember this is pre-radiocarbon dating, where artifact typologies were actually articulated in sequence vertically through archaeological stratigraphy. So there's a sense here of a sort of verification of how we were understanding past material culture. But at the same time, Clark and Godwin realized that there was another dynamic going on here, which is the gradient, or the edge of the fens, which was basically this relationship between age and altitude, but also what they called the surface available for settlement. So in effect, we start off with a landscape in the Mesolithic that has a small layer of peat, but lots of land. And then we end up by the early Bronze Age with a little bit of land and a lot of peat and silt. So there's this sense of this sort of time transgressive landscape as we watch basically the lower contours disappear beneath sediment. And if we look closer at this section, you can see something else, and it's another artifact that doesn't get talked about as much. But can you see that there's a stump of a preserved oak tree sitting on the old land surface and subsumed by the marine sediment? And then above that marine sediment, in the early part of the upper peat, there's a tree stump of a willow tree. And here we are actually seeing that same succession or development of the landscape in terms of that time transgressive environment. So we're seeing terrestrial woodland being replaced by wet woodland. And in a way, this is the sort of book that we take out into the fens, or the image that we take out into the fens at Moss Farm in our trying to articulate that same sort of dynamic, the relationship between the gradient and the deposition of sediment, or that time transgressive environment. So this is Moss Farm Quarry. And as you can see straight away, that the section in the background is the equivalent to Peacock's Farm. See the lower peat, the fen clay, and the upper peat. You can also see the gradient of the natural. And in a way, I feel like within the aperture of the quarry, we're able to repeat what the Fenland Research Committee did in a single trench over and over again as the quarry progresses across the landscape. To the extent that we even find the oak trees, the bog oaks, sitting at that same interface between the lower peat and the fen clay. And we also find tree stumps and branches of the same tree where they've been trimmed and been worked, and wood chips. So there's a real sense here of activity on the edge in the later Neolithic. And the great thing about bog oaks is that they are there to be dated. They can be looked at by dendrochronologists, and we can start looking at when they started growing, but also when they died. So we can put that into our understanding or our articulation of that sediments or the stratigraphy. So our mantra on site basically is see tree, slice tree, and we've taken over now 80 samples from these bog oaks, and we've had these processed by Ian Tyers, and we're now being able to show that these oaks are datable between, or growing between, around 2600 BC and 2300 BC. And in effect, they're dating the arrival of the sea. So oaks can tolerate getting their feet wet, but they cannot tolerate a marine environment. The salt water kills them dead. So we're seeing this sort of environmental event being recorded in the death of all these trees. So that's the quarry, that's our sort of aperture, our window, and the landscape it takes us into is the Fenland Basin. And if I grab the laser pointer, just over here we can see the island of Whittlesea. We can see the Nene coming out of Northamptonshire through Peterborough and debouching into the Fenland Basin. And that little embayment there is the Flag Fen Basin, which is where the Moss Farm quarry is and where we spend a lot of our time basically excavating these earlier landscapes. And what this map shows is obscuration. This is from the Inglade project from the University of Oxford, where they basically showed where the ground cover is so dense that you cannot use aerial photography or geophysical survey. It's an area of 100% obscuration. There's no real way of getting at detecting what kinds of sites live or exist beneath these deposits. So it's a sense of a blank zone. But also, as I've just shown in my earlier slides, it's a place that's got depth. It's also got preservation. So this is the Flag Fen Basin, and it's a combination here of the landscape that we excavate, as in the later Bronze Age landscape, but also overlain with the sort of the place names of modern Peterborough and modern Whittlesea. So you can see Whittlesea Island, and you can see Fengate, the sort of industrial estate of Peterborough itself, and Stand Ground. And then you can see the Flag Fen Basin, and then you can see our Paleo Channel winding its way through, and you can see where the site of Must Farm is. So I want to give a little bit of context, really, I suppose, in the sense that if you dig a small hole in the fens, 9 times out of 10 it will do this. It will fill with water. It's the bonus of this place in terms of its preservation, hence why we get all the organic preservation. We can find things like wood, but also obviously it's an inhibitor in the sense that if you're not careful, you'll drown, or the sides will collapse, or it's not an easy place to access the archaeology itself. So how do we get past that? How do we get to see these deeply buried landscapes, and how do we get to see them at scale without being basically underwater? Well, of course, my answer is the Moss Farm quarry, the brick pit. This is the biggest hole in Fenland, and it's our window on the deep deposits. So what you've got here is the working quarry. So at the base is the Jurassic clay that's being mined for brick making. You can then see the Pleistocene gravels, but everything above that gravel band is the Holocene. And we've even got the lower peat, the fen clay, and the upper peat sequence. And then we've got big cuts of paleo channels, basically the prehistoric Nene cutting through the quarry as well. So their endeavour to get deep allows us to get deep too, but we're not going to the depths that they're after. So we stay dry and we get this accessible approach to the archaeology itself. The other thing to say about this section is that it's got a big smile in it. You can just see here, which is the Moss Farm Paleo Channel. And the Moss Farm Paleo Channel is the context of the Moss Farm pile dwelling settlement. So you'll notice that a lot of my slides feature this same sort of contour. You see the edge, you see the lower peat, the fen clay, and the upper peat. And in that sequence, you can see the position of the Moss Farm Rodden, and then its freshwater channel sat in the top, which is the context of much of our investigation. You can also see that the time transgressive environment that we're working within goes through freshwater and marine phases. So there's a sense here of environmental impact. So that oak tree that I showed you that we take samples from the bog oak sits round about here. So this is our paleo channel. So the pale grey silts is the Rodden, and the darker grey silts is the freshwater channel. And it gives you a sense of scale and how we're able to approach it. So we started digging the Moss Farm Paleo Channel in 2009 properly, and finished excavating it in 2016 with the pile dwelling settlement. And this is off-site from the pile dwelling settlement. This is over adjacent to it. And this is where basically we were able to dig 320 meters of the paleochannel in its entirety and understand it. So what you've got here is a freshwater channel that is slow moving, sluggish, the sediment's dropping very gently. There's nothing erosive about it at all. It dates to about 1600 BC at the bottom and 100 BC at the top. And everything that basically gets deposited in this channel, we're able to excavate. The other thing to say about sediment of the paleochannel is that it's non-porous. So it's just beautiful at preserving wet things within its context. It's not wet itself, but it doesn't allow water to escape or air to enter. So in 2009, we started looking at the paleochannel and started to realize its potential, I suppose, because the first things we were finding with the metal detector were Bronze Age weapons. So things like the spear, but as always at Must Farm, it also comes with the spear shaft still attached. And then this leaf-shaped sword from a similar context within the paleochannel. And to the point where in that 320 meters, we found multiple metal items, including things towards the bottom, such as this rapier, the leaf-shaped sword in the middle, and then right at the top where the peat was forming, we were finding these late Iron Age iron swords. So almost like harping back to Peacock's farm and this idea of material culture being articulated in its temporal sequence, the same happens with the paleochannel. So in that 320 meters, we excavated, we were able to find 10 fish weirs. This is one of them. You can see that basically it's preserved, it's a chevron shaped. You can see where the stakes have fallen over and the waterwork going along it. And in association with the fish weirs, we also found 24 fish traps or eel traps. And these were located along that same length of channel. All of these were coming back to radiocarbon dates for sort of 1600, 1500 Cal BC. And they all sit at the early stage of that sediment sequence. In that same profile, we found the remains or complete versions of 9 log boats. And here's 2 of them. You can just see the level of preservation and their context and relationship to the profile of the channel, and also some of the excavation methods as well. So in total, we found 9 log boats, 7 of which were Bronze Age and 2 of which were Iron Age. And these were sort of almost evenly sort of dotted through that vertical section. So a sense here that the channel was a busy place. And a nice thing about this slide is that you can see where it's rained, the channel is starting to refill with water, so you get a sense of its scale. And I suppose that's the other thing about Fenland archaeology is that it's this absence of truncation and this sense of absence of palimpsest. Everything seems to be in sequence and there's very little in the way of intrusiveness. So unlike a sort of sites that are much closer to the surface where the Roman archaeology intrudes on the Iron Age archaeology that then intrudes on the Bronze Age archaeology, here sediment keeps things apart. So there's a real sense of things are still in place. It's quite eerie, really, in terms of excavating it. You feel like the people haven't long left the site. So the sediment sequence is different from the profiles I showed you earlier in the sense that obviously there's no buried soil. These are fluvial silts. This is a river channel. And it's difficult to think of surfaces, lived on surfaces or surfaces available for settlement. But in a way, I think that we're starting to change that now. We're starting to consider these wet deposits as also places of intensive activity. So whether it's fishing or canoeing or the deposition of metalwork and things, it's all part of that story. And on the base of this slide, you can see the profile through that same section through the paleochannel and the complexity of the sediments and things. So this is a plan of the 2009-2012 excavations of the paleochannel. You can see our giant bolts going across it. You can see the location of the log boats and the fish weirs and all of the different artifacts that came out of its profile. And what it demonstrates really is that it's a busy place. And now you have to remember that this channel goes on for kilometers. We're the first people to investigate it at any scale. We open 320 meters and we find 9 log boats. So there's a sense here that this is telling us something about the rest of the channel beyond the confines of the quarry pit. So if we go from the paleochannel to the pile dwelling site, we can see that all we have to do is travel downstream a couple of 100 meters, and we can basically visit the pole dwelling itself. The thing to remember about the pole dwelling site is that it's higher up the profile from the fish weirs and the fish traps. There's a bit like the test pit I showed at the beginning. There's a separation in depth and also a separation in time. So the same river silts that we excavated around the log boats and the fish traps and the metalwork, we also excavated from around the remains of the architecture of the pole dwelling settlement. And this is, I suppose, quite a classic slide now of the Moss Farm pole dwelling settlement excavations. It really does demonstrate our methodology. You notice that we spent most of our time laying on a front on muddy planks, and you'll notice that there are no mattocks or shovels. In fact, there's barely a tool in sight, and most of the excavation was done with the tips of your fingers or a little wooden clay modeling tool. There's that sense of trying to expose the sort of density or the complexity of the settlement remains. So here's a bigger picture of the settlement itself. So just so you know, this is the southern bank of the river running along here. And you can see it's marked by the palisade that enclosed the settlement. The center of the channel is about here. And then you can see the remains of individual structures. You can see the rafter fans of individual roofs and the circles of individual stilted roundhouses. And I've just put up in the corner a picture of the temporary warehouse that we put up, of which this excavation is occurring within, just to give you a sense of the environment that we spent 12 months within. So the same sluggish silts that protected the log boats from the fish weirs is also the matrix of this settlement. It's just that we're higher up in the profile itself. We've lost half the settlement to the quarry, so the old quarry edge disappears off here. So here's that same image, but in plan. This is a photogrammetric image of the settlement. You can see a modern pipe trench cut through the settlement here. You can see the quarries taking away this part of the settlement. And then you can see the palisade running along the edge of the river itself. And then you get the impression of the individual structures. You can see the spokes and the wheels, basically the rafters of individual houses. And here's the plan of our encounter with the Moss Farm pile dwelling settlement. So what is it? It's a mass of charred and waterlogged wood. And the majority of the horizontal timbers you can see are charred, and the majority of the uprights, almost every single one, are unburnt, and they're just preserved through being waterlogged. So it tells us something about the dynamics of the end of the settlement and its collapse. You'll also notice that amongst all of the wooden beams and timber elements and things, there's the silhouette of a wooden wheel just here, which also occurs in our distribution of material culture. So I've pushed the wooden architectural elements back and brought forward all of the material culture, including things like the animal bone assemblage. So you get a sense of the complexity that we were dealing with and trying to understand the sort of the mess, I suppose, of architectural remains and contents of the settlement. So this is the plan of the collapsed settlement, and then this is our understanding or interpretation of the actual layout of the settlement. So you can see the palisade is something that we can trace all the way through that sequence. You see how it basically encompasses the settlement. And then you can see within that, we identified 5 structures, 4 of which were round and 1 of which was square or rectangular. We're also able to identify a central walkway, a light structural walkway running around the inside of the palisade, and then with concentrations of material culture and animal bone, the beginnings of formative middens, filling in the holes or forming halos around the footprints of the structures themselves. So in excavating the site, we had a sense of basically beneath structures and around structures. So around the structures, we found these deposits, which we called formative middens. They were mostly made up of fragmented material culture, so broken pots and butchered animal bone and burnt stones and things. But mostly the material culture itself was unburnt. it had been deposited before the settlement had caught fire and burnt down. Whereas within the footprints of the individual structures, we found complete objects like pots and wooden artifacts that were almost wholly burnt or fire damaged, but often in a complete state. So we had this sort of division between material that was being deposited during the lifetime of the settlement and material that was deposited at the point of the conflagration. So our excavation really was about trying to disentangle that contextual mess, really, trying to understand how things related and what was the sort of toponymy, I suppose, of the deposition sequence. So here you get a sense of the sort of jumble, really. You can see there's a complete pot, there's an upturned wooden trough, there's a wooden bucket, there's some architectural elements with mortise and tenon joints, there's bits of the roof, bits of clay and turf and things. So this is the story of the excavation, really. And the thing to say about that deposit is that it had no depth. So remember the big section I showed you through the Paleo Channel, we were able to show you river sediment successively building up. Well, our settlement had a single layer in effect, and it was this deposit. So beneath it was river channel sediments, and above it was river channel sediments. And in this sort of 10 to 21 centimetre thick layer was all of the remains of the settlement itself. And we were visited during the excavation by Professor Stephanie Jacquemet from the Circumalpine region, from Bern University, who's been used to digging Neolithic pile-dwelling settlements in Switzerland. And she just said, "You lucky buggers," she said, basically, that we were able to have such clarity over our stratigraphy. She was used to sections like this, where 100 years of settlement was basically a series of very fine laminations. And they were there trying to identify single occupations, whereas all we had was a single layer. But there was complexity to that single layer. So not only was there this sort of spatial difference between what was beneath the footprints of the buildings and what was around them, but also, and very fortunately for us, there was a sense that where things fell was pretty much where they had been above the river before they were deposited. So, for example, on the riverbed, we found the wood chips of construction. So what you can see in front of you is some of the piles, but also these blonde-looking wood chips here. These are fragments of where the ash piles have been trimmed, ready to be inserted into the riverbed. And the black ones are the oak wood chips. And again, it's part of the same process. And our understanding of the channel is that it was so sluggish, so stagnant, and so heavily vegetated that it basically acted like a hairbrush. So if things dropped into it, they pretty much stayed where they fell. So this is a distribution of those wood chips relative to the settlement. What was interesting about it was that if there were ash uprights, they tended to be ash wood chips. If there were oak uprights, they tended to be oak wood chips. And this gave us real confidence about all the other aspects of deposition or spatial pattern. So, for example, I've plotted here all the oak piles. So this is the sort of footprint of the settlement. This is it laying out, really. So you can see the oak piles are basically set out the alignment of the palisade, but also you can see the structures starting to form. And the oak piles look like the two here. So this one and this one. And you can see these are basically whole trees that have been felled. They've had their branches trimmed, but beyond that, there's very little conversion. And then they've been driven into the river silts. And then in turn, added to that oak layout was the ash palisade and the supplementary stakes for the individual structures. So you can see there's a real sort of plan about the way the settlement's been constructed. And this is a close-up of the ash palisade. I'm seeing it under excavation as well. So you can see the preservation is just tremendous. So in looking at that sort of formality of the architecture, what's really interesting is that you can see that the predominant wood used in the construction of the settlement is oak and ash, and also that there's a sort of uniformity or formalization in its use within each of the structures. There's something here that says that this isn't ad hoc. This is a well-practiced architecture, something that people were used to, was accomplished, which gives me sort of confidence that we're not digging some kind of anomaly, but we're actually digging pattern. And this is a reconstruction image by Judith Dobie from Historic England. And it's really this idea that the wood used in the construction of the settlement came from a terrestrial source. It's not from the fen itself. It's oak and ash. And these are young trees, maybe 40, 50 years old when they're being felled to be made into the settlement. So it's almost as if maybe there's a sort of slight sense here of pre-planning or managed woodland or something like that. So if we go back to structure one, this is it in plan. You can see that we've got I've highlighted the palisade, the light structure or palisade walkway. I've also shown the oak uprights of structure one, the outer ring and the inner ring, and then you can see the rafters of the roof where they've collapsed. And here, what's important is that we cut slices through these for dendrochronology in the hope that we might get a construction date and understand something about the sequence of building and things. But unfortunately, the tree rings fall out of the known reference. So Ian wasn't able to say it was built in this year, but what he was able to say with great confidence was that all of the trees built in the construction of the settlement were all felled in the same year. So what he called his year zero. And the other thing he said was that the nature of the timbers that he was able to date, where they'd been burnt, he felt that there was a distortion that suggested that the wood was still green at the point of the conflagration. So he was suggesting that they hadn't been seasoned, and oak takes 12 months or so to season. So his suggestion was that our settlement was constructed as one, and within 9 to 12 months, it was burnt down as one. So suddenly we had this brevity or foreshortened window on the duration of our settlement. And at the same time, we were perhaps giving some sort of validation to our understanding of the stratigraphy as well, that that simplicity or lack of depth and the formative nature of the middens was also being reflected in our understanding of the tree rings and the construction of the settlement itself. So here's a pile dwelling. This is a crannog. This is Loch Tay. I don't know if you guys remember, but in 2021, it burnt down. It caught fire, and with 6 minutes, it was gone. And I use this slide really as a sort of sense of reconstruction. So the sort of temporality of the settlement might be 12 to 9 months, but the duration of its destruction might have only been a matter of minutes. And we can see the remnants of the Loch Tay reconstructed crannog and how it looks. And then we can compare that to our settlement. So this is structure one again. You can see there's a real sense here of similarity or parallel. Here is the collapsed structure in the bottom of the riverbed. So again, that thin stratigraphy is very apparent in here. You can see as we're removing quarters of the building, we can start to see what's beneath the roof. These are the roof rafters. You can see the wood chips over here, and you can start seeing the remnants of the wattle floors. So in terms of our understanding of the construction of structure one or all of the buildings, is that we have a double ring of posts with floor joists and a light wattle floor, and then ring beams going around the uprights, and then rafters and purlins. And it's a very simple sort of cone and cylinder construction with a very heavy roof, but very light floors and walls sat above a small watercourse, looking something like this in profile. And you can see these bold joists that we found. So we found these sort of narrow diameter, sort of alder and willow poles that had been driven into the riverbed and bent over to create these sort of springy floors. And this is a reconstruction by Neath Shepherd, and you can see here the sense of the sort of size of the building, but its relationship to the water itself. So we looked at the distribution of the material culture to get some sort of sense of the use of space. Our confidence from the wood chips was brought to bear on other items. So for example, here we have pottery and animal bone, and you can see the distribution of pottery in red and the distribution of animal bone in blue. And what was interesting was that the formative middens had lots of animal bone, but the floor imprints had very little, whereas the formative middens had some pottery, but the majority of the pottery was deposited as with the collapse of the structures themselves. And we think that's to do with the temporality or the brevity of duration of the settlement, but also the fact that the fire was unplanned. It was something that basically took them by surprise, and there wasn't time to gather things up. And basically, they ran for their lives in those 6 minutes that they had, and all of the contents of the settlement fell to the riverbed. I think if the settlement lasted longer, we would have seen this bar chart change. We would have seen more pottery being deposited as pots were broken. And let's say it lasted 20 years, you feel like there would be a reversal in the numbers. So we took all of the pottery and the animal bone, and we laid it out on the floor on the grid of the excavation, and we tried putting it all back together again to get at some sort of dynamic between, could we get broken pots related to individual structures? Could we work out how many vessels were present in each building? Could we see the sort of the attrition of that? Could we get at butchery events? Could we see which of the middens belonged to which of the buildings and what kinds of animals they were eating and things? So this was our endeavor in post-excavation. So all the animal bone was laid out on these carpet squares, which basically used as a sort of a representation of our site grid. And Vida and Clara spent 5 days basically trying to stick it all back together again. And they identified that the bulk of the assemblage was made up of things like red deer and wild boar and pig and young lambs, and also that we were getting lots of joints and things. So we were getting sort of chops of meat from deer and boar and pig. But what we were also recognizing was that not all of the animal was being represented. So we were getting portions. There was a real sense that the animal was being butchered off site and only part of it was coming to our settlement. So we did the same as Vida and Clara did with the animal bone, we did with the pottery. We used the same floor, the same carpet tiles. We marked all the sherds and laid them all out, and then tried sticking them back together again. And here's a short video of that process. And you can see it's basically a roll of masking tape. Take your shoes off and just keep going around and just keep sticking sherds back together again until you get all the complete pots. And you can see the vessel start to sort of grow out of the carpet as we go through this process. So we started off with 2,188 sherds, and we ended up with 128 pottery vessels. And we had a tray the size of a small seed tray of sherds that we couldn't assign to a vessel. So there was a real sense here of a comprehensive and contained assemblage. This idea of the sort of spatial division of the palisade was containing the assemblage, and that short brevity of the settlement of 12 months was giving us that sort of boundary to how much the assemblage was basically could extend itself. So we felt like we had everything present. So you can see from the refitting exercise, we're able to show where sherds had gone into the middens, but also where sherds had been left behind in the floors of individual buildings. So we're able to re-relate pots back to buildings in that sort of breakage history. So we're able then to build assemblages for individual structures. So structure 1 is at the top and structure 4 is lower down. And what we noticed was that structure 1 had deposited a lot more pottery during occupation than it did during the conflagration. And this is partly because structure 4 is the rectangular building. We think that it was introduced slightly later on in the settlement history, and it hadn't had time yet to break lots of pots. So our image at the end of the refitting exercise was of individual groups of pots belonging to individual structures. So it felt coherent and comprehensive. And a bit like the wood chips, we had a real sort of sense of confidence that this pattern was real. So a sense here of a year's worth of pottery, and all of its various sizes and forms, from small cups to large storage jars. And it's a real sense here of capacity as well. So this is a chart just giving us the volume for individual vessels and things. And often we get asked about, what was the population of the Moss Farm Pile Dwelling settlement and things, and how do we work out how many people live there and things. And I find it interesting that just for the idea that a bowl is the size of a meal, or the average human stomach's about the size, about a litre sort of thing. And you notice that all of these bowls down here, I think, is telling us about something about the population of the Moss Farm Pile Dwelling settlement. So obviously pots are containers, they hold things. So we were finding pots within pots. We're finding pots with charred food crusts and burnt food and drink concretions. We had a pot with a food crust with a wooden spoon stuck in it. And there was a real sense here that this was I think in medieval times it was called fromity or something like that, but it's a sort of porridge mix with wheat meal and animal fats and things. So we're getting at diet to the point where we can start thinking about menu as well. So we have cereals and honey and dairy and meat and things, and a real sense here of what was being consumed within the settlement itself. And to go with all of that, there's, as well as there being the ceramic vessels, there are also the wooden vessels. So there are buckets and bread proving troughs and stitch bark containers and things like that. And you can start to get a sense of their distribution and relationship to the pottery vessels as well in the individual structures. And of course, some of these vessels were also containing things like clean grain and wheat meal and were storage for the next season's seed crop, basically, to plant again. So barley and wheat and things like that, and flax and stuff. So again, the sort of resolution really is being so complete and so comprehensive. We didn't just dig the site with our fingertips. We also put every square that we excavated within that settlement horizon through a 4mm mesh. So we sieved everything so we could get at the sort of the smaller element of the site. So you can see here a typical square, the sort of distribution of charcoal versus bits of waterlogged wood and bits of pottery and bits of shell and things. But also in that sieving, we were able to identify things like lamb droppings. So the green blobs you can see, or circles you can see on here, are distributions of lamb pellets, and they are charred. We found the articulated remains of lambs inside the structures. We think they were the only real victims of the fire, I suppose, and that they died in the conflagration. But you can see that the distribution of lamb droppings fits where the lambs were found. And then we also found coprolites belonging to dogs, and they seem to have a distribution equivalent to where we found the dog bones. So there's a sense, again, of that sort of clarity of context. And then just to give a sort of sense, really, I mean, I don't have time today to give you the full Must Farm story, but a bit of its inventory, really. So things like, and things that you'd find on a less well-preserved site. So things like spindle whorls. But obviously at Must Farm, you get the spindle whorls and you get the yarn and the textiles. So flax and lime bast and things, all being preserved through being carbonized. Or necklaces. So two of the structures had the remains of necklaces, including glass beads that I'm certain were being made in the Eastern Mediterranean, maybe as far as Iran or Egypt. And then the wooden wheel that I showed you earlier on. So again, there's this sort of contradiction here, I suppose, of that sort of contrast between living above water, but also having some connection with the adjacent terrestrial world. And then, of course, the metalwork. And I think the metalwork is interesting in a sense that if we're right in understanding that what we're seeing is a complete register of contents of a Bronze Age settlement, and that each of the households is giving us a sense of how much stuff people had, then the quantity of metalwork seems to be quite a revelation, really, in a sense that perhaps we'd seen metalwork as being quite a rare thing. And yet at Must Farm, we've got structure one, and this is its inventory of axes and sickles and spears and razors and gouges and things. So, and this seemed to occur across the settlements. There's a real sense here that everyone had a lot of stuff. These structures were cluttered. There was a lot of material culture. So we can create a sort of, I don't know, a summation really of the Must Farm pile dwelling settlement. We can say that it was 400 square meters of what survived. It lasted for 9 to 12 months. We had 155 charred plant fiber fabrics, 198 wooden and bark objects, 128 pottery vessels, 95 pieces of metalwork, 56 beads, 6 querns, 52 work flints, loom weights, spindle wheels, bone tools. And all this is occurring within a year of a life. So you feel in a way that we've created a sort of a barometer or a scale for settlement elsewhere where the preservation isn't as good. So is Must Farm extraordinary? Yes, it is in terms of its preservation, but is it actually in terms of what it's telling us about past settlement? And in a way, I quite like what George Perec says about this idea of observing the infraordinary, the everyday, the routine, the habitual aspects of life and things. And maybe that's what we've got at Must Farm, and that these individual inventories here for each of these structures is actually representative of what a Bronze Age household had in the mid-9th century BC. And again, as well as getting quantity, we've also got that sort of qualitative evidence of distribution. So we can talk about how the houses were used, the footprints, which side of the structures were where the looms were, or where pottery was being used, or where they were sleeping and things. And you can see again across the structures, the patterns are very similar. So going back to our reconstruction of Must Farm, it's like, you know, people say, well, where do these people come from? And, who built these structures? Well, I suppose one of the first answers to that is that the house is a round house. It looks like every other structure we dig in Bronze Age Britain, but it's on stilts. But we know that in the Flag Fen Basin, there's a long tradition of people building pile-built structures. So Flag Fen has the causeway that dates from about 1300 through to 900 BC. Underneath our settlement, we found a causeway that dates from about 1400 BC. So we know that there is this tradition of people putting piles into the wet to build, to live on. So the pile dwelling settlement doesn't come out of a vacuum, but it's part of a tradition within this landscape. So sites like Flag Fen and the Moss Farm Causeway are the sort of precursors to people living on water. And just to sort of finish off, really, that sense of the sort of detail that we get out of this landscape, and going back to my initial slide about age and altitude. So on one axis of this table, you can see the height OD, and on the lower axis, you can see basically calendar years. So the Moss Farm Causeway that predates the settlement, you can see is coming in at about 1400 BC. But we've got the Flag Fen Causeway. We've now got a post alignment over at Stanground that's dating to the late Iron Age. But if I add the sort of curve to that, you can see that same times transgressive environment. You can see how basically as the sediment is building up through this watery environment, people are moving up that contour or having to get higher or build themselves above the water level and things. So my last few slides now is just the sense of that pattern, I suppose, and how fortunate we are to have a landscape like the Flag Fen Basin with a bloody great brick pit in the middle of it, that we're able to start to build these stories from the soap marsh of the fen clay and the round barrows that I showed you at the very beginning, sitting in the Neem washes, through to the field systems of Fengate and Bradley Fen, through to the causeways at Flag Fen and Moss Farm, and then through to the settlement of the Moss Farm pile dwelling settlement on the Paleo Channel itself, around about 850 BC. So a sense here that the depth has this intactness, this articulation, that we're able to dig this sort of real understanding of relationship and of duration. So I go back to my slide and to remind you really that scale of excavation, we've only dug this little bit of the Paleo Channel, and we've got a settlement and logboats and metalwork and fish weirs and fish traps. What happens if we take all of this experience out of the Moss Farm Quarry and go out into Greater Fenland? Is it possible that we can find Moss Farm 2 or Moss Farm 3 or whatever to show that this is typical and not some ad hoc anomaly within the pattern of past settlement? Now, of course, all of this we excavated within the confines of a pit, but we have to remind ourselves that the sites weren't found through the excavation. It's basically explicit through the excavation of clay or archaeology within the brick pit. They were found by serendipity. So Moss Farm was first found in the edge of an extinct quarry pit in 1999 by Martin Redding, just like Flag Fen was found in the edge of Moss Dyke by Francis Pryor in 1982. It's people mooching about and stumbling over a piece of wood in an already exposed aperture into deep Fenland. And you can see that it was inauspicious. So Moss Farm began as a post stuck out of some silt next to an old brick, and Flag Fen was the same, a few bits of wood out the side of the pit. And these are two of the most important Bronze Age landscapes in the UK. And this is their beginning. So it's about finding ways of getting at that depth. So it's 25 years since the site was discovered in 1999. It's first evaluated in 2004, excavated in 2015, and the publication is now out in 2024. And it's taken us 25 years to dig, basically, or to analyse a year in the life of a single settlement. And that's what's contained within the publication. So this is just a reminder, really, that these books are open access, but also of all the people that are involved in this work. So the authors, the editors, the specialists, the excavators, the organisations that were behind the funding of the projects are all basically present within these volumes and things. So that sense of the scale of our endeavour, really, but also the scale of our knowledge. And you can see that because, I can't give you all of Must Farm in this presentation. I'm already running out of time. You can see volume 1 is our interpretive narrative, but you can see how thick volume 2 is in terms of the specialist analysis of all of those different sets of evidences from the settlement itself. So I'm going to finish off with 2 slides. And one is an image back into the fields outside of the quarry. So this is south of Whittlesea, down following our paleo channel. We take Birkbeck students out into the fens. We dig punch holes, pinholes into the sediment, and we hand sort through that silt to see if we can find traces. And in 2016, we found a fish trap. But I think in a way, what's really interesting me is that we also found wood chips. And it's that sense that we know that they're out there, and that sort of finding the big in the small. So the aperture is great for giving us the expertise and the knowledge about what's out there, but it's now the possibility that we can go out there with these test pits and find Must Farm too. So with that, I'll finish, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was absolutely fantastic, and just a tiny little glimpse in. Now, you won't be surprised, we have lots of questions. Now, some of them you've sort of answered in parts of your talk because we got to them. I'm going to try and go through them, but excuse me if I don't ask your question, because I think I'm doing that because I think Mark might have already answered it. But the first one up, nice, easy question for you. Richard would like to know, what is a rodden?
Good question. Okay, rodden is it's a Fenland term. It's a silted up tidal creek or river. So basically, when the sea inundated, it cut all these channels, and on its twice daily tides, it would bring in sand and deposit silt, and basically it would clog itself, and they become these huge sort of clogged arteries in the fens, and they're so consolidated that the rest of Fenland, where it's peaty and silty, it's all like blancmange and things, these channels become these sort of proud linear features. So if you go into Fenland and you go down one of its roads and you go over a hump, there's every chance you're going over one of these roddens. And if you see a farmstead in deep Fenland, there's every chance that it's built on one of these roddens too. So rodden is basically a term for a choked channel from the Bronze Age.
Yeah, I mean, I always love talking about bouncy roads in the Fenlands, you know, because of that, how that change in the topography is because of the water and where the water's gone and whether it's dried out. And it's, you know, you get a sense that you're driving through that deep time. Nigel asks a question about the metal weapons in the Paleo Channel. They're not damaged or destroyed, as you see in very frequently in ritual deposition. What do you think are your thoughts on their deposition? How are they ending up in that ground? Why?
Good question. Good question. We have got a sort that we found. In fact, there are 2 that are bent in half. So there are some that are damaged. I'm sure it's part of the story of deposition of metalwork into wet places. I'm sure it's the same reason why, you know, equivalent metalwork gets dredged out of the Thames and things. I'm sure there's elements there of deliberate deposition. What that's associated with, whether that's, you know, a burial aspect or some sort of ritual deposition or something like that, I don't know. But it's interesting that we also find disarticulated parts of human skeletons in the same context, not necessarily in association with the metalwork, but within the same horizons and things. So there is that possibility that we're seeing formal events, and that these are the sort of residues of those. So
brilliant. Okay, so there's a number of questions around the pottery and trade. So roughly they're coming around, were the pots made on site, or do you think people are importing them in? So did you find any evidence of that?
We think the pots were made locally. The clays are basically consistent with local sources. We think the pots, Matt Brudenell, the pottery specialist, thinks the pots are being made by skilled potters. At least the majority of them are. And he also thinks that it's made by only 1 or 2 hands. There's such a consistency in the form, and it's almost as if we're basically only seeing 1 or 2 potters for the whole of the assemblage. And occasionally in amongst that assemblage, you see a vessel that looks completely out of character, and it looks like something my daughter would have made. And it's almost as if they might be the homemade versions, and that the rest of the set is something that is being basically, it is being brought into the settlement, but maybe the potter's not too far away, if you know what I mean. So
yeah, absolutely. Okay, another couple of questions around the relationship with Flag Fen. Do you think there is a direct relationship at all? And what would that relationship be?
it's funny. I think earlier on we thought the relationship there wasn't one. We thought that the chronology gave us that our settlement post-dated Flag Fen itself. But I think the more work we do on Flag Fen, the more we're starting to realise that there is some overlap. But you have to remember that Flag Fen has hundreds of years of construction, of maintenance, of deposition, and our settlement lasts for 12 months. So it's difficult to compare exactly, but I'm sure it's part of the same tradition. And there are elements of material culture that are found at Flag Fen that you could drop into our settlement and you wouldn't notice the difference. So we're part of that world. It's whether we can identify a discrete horizon or a discrete set of architecture within Flag Fen that fits in with within our story. So
yeah, okay, so you've set out that amazing 25-year story of the discovery, but a couple of questions here about that thing. When did you realize the significance of what you've actually got on your hands? Because obviously what Mark saw was a post, but when did it really hit you that you'd got something, you know, quite special?
it's funny, isn't it? It took a long time, I think. And when Martin first showed us the post sticking out the side of the quarry pit, we were all skeptical. We thought it was part of the quarry workings or something like that. A couple of my colleagues donned waders and waded out into the quarry pit and snapped bits of wood off the uprights. We sent it off for radiocarbon dating, and it came back as Bronze Age. So that's when we knew that it was Bronze Age. But we were in the landscape of Flag Fen, so we thought it was another timber alignment or something like that. In 2006, we did a proper trench across it. And that's when we started finding the textiles and the metalwork and the material culture. But at that time, we called it a platform because we didn't have the idea of discrete architecture. We just thought it was some sort of generic elevation above the water, basically. And also, we didn't really understand the relationship between the material culture and the architecture itself. And there was a sense that maybe we were seeing some real exaggerated form of watery deposition, and that all this metalwork and pottery that we were finding still wasn't to do with settlement, but was actually to do with, you know, ritual gestures into the watery gods and all that sort of thing. I would say it wasn't until 2015 when we opened up the site and started to recognize that we had discrete structures that it really hit us what we were excavating. That was the game changer. And it was a real, I don't know, it's difficult to say that within the 12-month period that we were excavating the site, we were constantly being shocked or surprised or impressed or having our preconceptions changed about what it was we were excavating and things. So it was that kind of site, really. So
no, it's good to see Martin's asked a question. I'll come back to his a bit later. So, but one question was, what was the best discovery point for you? Linked to that idea that quite a few people really love the reconstructing the pots video, but for you, what's your real takeaway moment?
It's a good one, isn't it? Do you know what? When we excavated the structures and started finding the articulated lambs, what I found interesting about that was that, because when we took the roofs off the building, we thought, are we going to find the occupiers of the settlement? Are we going to find skeletons beneath the roof? They're, charred and calcined and things. And we didn't find them. But then we found these 3 to 6 month old lambs who obviously died in the conflagration. And then there was, through the sieving of the sediment, we found their lamb droppings, which confirmed that they were present in those structures at the point of the conflagration. But the other thing about those lambs is that they were born, lived, and died within that time frame of the settlement itself. So that 9 to 12 months is longer than the duration of the lambs themselves, which meant when it came to doing radiocarbon dating, our radiocarbon specialist, Peter Marshall from Historic England, saw those lambs as a way of actually refining our understanding of our year zero. He knew that they could have only existed within the duration of the settlement itself. And they came back with a date, I think it was something like I think it's 859 to 838 or something like that BC. So it's 10 years either side of that 850 BC. So we know it's the middle of the 9th century. So they've given us that resolution, I think, that real sense of detail within the settlements.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely fascinating. The ability to use different bits of deposition to actually refine that story and actually put that together. I mean, I know personally one of the things I've always been fascinated about your work is your ability to visualize this stuff. When did those patterns start coming through? Was it when you actually put the drawings together? And how quickly is that actually happening? Are you getting that realization whilst you're still excavating?
Yes.
That actually this conglomerate of stuff actually has relationships.
Yeah, I think so. And do you know what? It's, again, I can remember a day with the wood specialists, so Iona Robinson-Zecchi and Mike Banforth. We had a scaffold tile within the excavation that we could climb up and overview the excavation. And Mike said, well, this is when we were starting to see the piles and some of the timbers and things. And he said, you know, what shape are the buildings? And I went for that sort of preconception, because I was thinking, well, we're digging pile dwellings here. Pile dwellings in Europe are always rectangular. They're going to be rectangular shaped structures and things. And then Iona pointed out that you could see that we're just starting to see the arcs of roundhouses and things. So we were identifying individual structures, and then we were digging into individual structures. We were identifying their middens. We were starting to recognize components of the architecture and things. So I think it was all, to use a hotter term, I suppose, it was trial's edge in that sense of the interpretation and things. So, and also Donald Hall, who was producing these amazing photogrammetric plans. So basically he was based on site. So we had this sort of production line of drawings coming through all the time during excavation. So we almost got to the point where we were excavating the drawings, if that makes sense. So
great. Right. I mean, I'm still not getting through. There's still 22 questions going on here. This is really fantastic. But there are a couple of ones that I just want to explore with you to broaden out this conversation to a wider sort of landscape and UK conversation. So Martin Redding does ask, do you concur that the Fenland Wash landscape is actually just an extension of Doggerland, and perhaps we can include the Humber, the Broads, Debden, and the Fens estuary included in that conversation?
Yes, I think Godwin used to talk about the Fenland Basin as the southern margins of the North Sea. I think that gradient that I show so often in my sections, if we followed that down, we'd end up at Doggerland. And similarly, Vince Gaffney and Bradford University, they're working the other way. They're working from the bottom up. It's all part of the same contour. The history of sea level rise is the history of Fenland. I suppose also the seaboard, the connection to continental Europe, it's straightforward, isn't it? It's yeah, I imagine that the textiles from Us Farm went across the channel when the beads came back, or something like that. So
that really opens a really interesting concept to us, just what size the population might have been around that landscape. If you think we know, when you get to the Iron Age, you get small settlements every 2 to 3 miles in these valley landscapes. If you sort of roll out the Must Farm settlement, but then roll it all the way up the Fens out into Doggerland, that could be quite a number of people that are going to move around at some point when that sea level changes.
Yeah, it's a lot of time as well, though, isn't it? It's the Holocene, so it's I suppose it's partly what you're looking for, really, because I mean, one of the dreams we have is it's not just about trying to find Must Farm 2, but can we find Star Car 2? You know, where's the Fenland Star Car? I think at the moment it's 6-7 meters below the surface, and there isn't currently a way of accessing it.
Yes.
you just wonder how you get to that. But yeah, what I've got to do is live long enough, basically. So do you know what I mean? It's just that, and hope there's another. But I feel like we're learning all the time. There's always this sense of one of the real pleasures of this project is just the people that you get to work with and the knowledge that we've developed together over the years. We're so fortunate at the CAU of the real enthusiasm and engagement and real sense of possibility. A lot of people basically cut their teeth in the Paleo Channel, and now they went on to be the senior people in the excavations of the pile dwelling settlement. And you just feel like that's maybe that's going to be one of our most important legacies of this project. So if we are going to find Must Farm 2 or whatever it is that's out in those deep fens, it's going to be it's going to be these people, I think. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And that is the point of these sites, isn't it? It's not just about finding out about the past, but it's actually improving our own knowledge and our own skills and actually how we do that. So there was a question, did it require any specific innovations to excavate the site?
It's funny, isn't it? I think it did. I think it had photogrammetry was fundamental. I mean, I think it was done at such a dynamic way. It was so embedded in interpretation and understanding and articulation and what it was we were trying to achieve. But also, I suppose, so from our perspective, putting a bloody great warehouse over the top of the excavation was an innovation as well, because all we did was dig. We basically got there in the morning. You went back to where you left your digging tool the night before, and you just got on with it. You weren't covering and uncovering. You weren't trampling over what you did before. You weren't smothering it in things. You created this amazing diffuse environment where you could just get on with context. And I think a lot of the clarity that we got from this excavation was the fact that we were able to dig it in that manner. It could rain, the wind could blow, the sun could shine, whatever it wanted to do outside. But inside, we just carried on. We didn't miss a day. It was just that solid archaeology. And I think that shows in the publication. So.
Right, I'm just going to do, the questions are still going up. I'm sorry, everyone, we'll be here all night if I try and answer these. So I'm going to do two more, which I think are really important. So the first one comes from Aidan O'Sullivan, and it's a really interesting point. So Must Farm gives us a spectacular 3D view of a Bronze Age house, from the floor to the thatch, and then the complete set of roof timbers. Aidan is saying he thinks is unique. Do you think Bronze Age houses elsewhere would have looked like them with such a shallow pitched roof, or is Must Farm house architecture just unique to that environment?
Very good question. Obviously, they have to elevate the floor, so that's a difference to terrestrial architecture. But maybe the heavy roof is characteristic of what the architecture looked like up on the adjacent dry land. Maybe that's something that they didn't innovate in here, that they basically took the dry land template and built it on stilts. I don't know how we answer that question, I suppose. But I suppose it's really interesting that, if you ask a Bronze Age house specialist the diameter of a roundhouse, they'll probably say to you 8 meters. And ours are 8 meters. If you talked about the types of material culture in it and the sort of, I don't know, the footprint of it, it looks like a Bronze Age roundhouse elsewhere. So maybe it is the blueprint of what was being built elsewhere.
I'm going to do one more question, and cheekily, okay, Mark, I'm going to ask if we can somehow get the questions that are remaining off the webinar, would we be able to answer them sort of in a writing? And
yeah, of course we can,
because there are some amazing questions.
Let's do that. So that's a great idea.
And people are truly enthusiastic about this. But I think the last question I want to ask is one that focuses solely on the finds and the material. And it's a question about where are they going to be displayed? Are we going to be able to see them? And what should we do to actually find out more?
there's an exhibition. I mean, it's not everything, but it's a selection of the materials coming up. I think it opens next week at Peterborough Museum. So that will give you the first sight of it. I'd recommend going to see that. So yeah, Peterborough Museum. And then down the line, there are plans to do a much broader, fuller display of the materials and things. So
Brilliant.
that's the plan. So yeah, we know that we have not written the last word on this site or on those specialist reports. There are other people out there with different ideas or different techniques or applications, whatever, that can take this material and things. So in a way, our publication is the beginning of its interpretation, not the end. So
yeah, we've also, the chat's been inundated, Mark. We'll get you a copy of all of that so you can have a look at it, because there are some just such wonderful comments. Everyone thanking you for such an amazing job, and having dug with you, I know what an absolute privilege that is. So I'd just like to give my heartfelt thanks for actually taking the time, Mark, to talk to us tonight. It's a truly wonderful site, made absolutely real by your brilliant work and your brilliant style of excavation. Thank you so much. For everyone else, if you've enjoyed tonight's lecture, please do consider making a donation to the CBA to help us continue to offer events like this. We do put on our lecture series every week, and we do help young people access archaeology through things like the Young Archaeologists Club. Just a donation of £50 actually enables a young person to engage in the Young Archaeologists Club for a whole year. And we offer over 2,000 places each year to young people to experience archaeology and get involved. So please do think about helping us. Please do fill out the questionnaire that's been put in the chat. We'll also circulate it to you to everyone's email. I just want to now let you know about the next This Is Archaeology lecture, and it's another exciting one, everybody. So it is Echolands, a journey in search of Boudica with Duncan Mackay. That talk will be held on Thursday, the 16th of May. I know it's absolutely brilliant. I've read Duncan's book and I've actually interviewed him as well. And it's a really, really fascinating journey, a self-exploration of the story of Boudica and what it actually means to somebody, and how you can trace that story in the English and Welsh landscape. It's absolutely fascinating. So that'll be on Thursday, the 16th of May. So please do sign up for that. We will start promoting that next week. This lecture will be made available to CBA members by the CBA YouTube channel. You will be able to access that if you're a CBA member. If you're interested about becoming a member, please do visit our website and sign up, where you will get access to the whole series of This Is Archaeology lectures, which there are now over 24 of them. We've been doing this for a couple of years, and they're a fascinating insight to how the perception of archaeology is shifting and how new ideas are really coming to the fore. And it's something that we at the CBA are really passionate about, helping you learn and understand different approaches to looking at the world around us through the eyes of archaeologists. But for now, I would like to thank Mark one final time for a really brilliant presentation. Just so good to catch up with you. And I would like to thank everyone else for joining us, and I wish you a safe evening, and thank you very much indeed. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.